Hello, and welcome back to another episode of On the Trail with Miles James Dean. After a brief honeymoon hiatus, I'm very excited to be back with you. Throughout my journey, I had acknowledged and embraced the African and African American contributions for over 400 years to the exploration, expansion, and settlement of the United States, and the land itself was a constant reminder that culture is wedded to land and land to culture. At the time of my journey, and most likely it hasn't changed to this day, one third of Arizona was still in the hands of indigenous people, while much of the other was in court litigation. Pull up a chair and take a ride with me through the plains of Arizona. Welcome back. If you recall, each state I rode across had its own theme, for which I wrote short essays and interviewed university historians. And what differed in Arizona was that the focus shifted from African American contributions to indigenous people and the land they called Turtle Island. History books reveal to us, in limited scope, a few of the famous names of those who fought and died whilst trying to protect and ensure that their people, their culture, were not extinguished forever by the rapid advancement across Turtle Island by the white conquerors. While the exploits of those famous warriors and their people make fascinating historical reflection, the wholesale murder of innocent women and children in the massacres of that distant past still make uncomfortable reading today. When one looks upon the weather-lined faces depicted in the old black and white photographs, it is hard for some, and yet not for others, to imagine where they got their courage, their determination, and their fighting spirit to take on the overwhelming challenges that face them. But photographs never reveal the entirety of an individual or the circumstance. The sometimes uncomfortable truth to all of it is that in the law of conquest, to the victor goes the spoils of war. And the nation we now call America is a country that was forged through the violence and conquest of the indigenous people of Turtle Island by white people who are the descendants of Europe. However, the land known as Turtle Island was also forged through the violence and conquest by the indigenous people who were descendants of Asia, as they fought amongst each other over territorial control of the land. The implication of this conquest is that while indigenous people are indigenous to Turtle Island, white people are native to the newly formed country called America. But this is not without its irony, and the profoundness of this irony, of this conquest, is that recently, and lasting for 4 years, white Americans and others were being set up to relinquish their power grab of the indigenous territory by their own governing body, by permitting tens of millions of people who are not native to America and with no vested interest in it to enter America under the pretense that America can provide them with all the covenants afforded to the American citizenry. That unchecked invasion was akin to cutting off your nose despite your face. Because when the bottom falls out, and surely it was going to, white Native Americans will be outnumbered and possibly finding themselves under siege, as were the indigenous people that were conquered by their ancestors. Everybody and their mama knows that if unchecked, history will always repeat itself, and the reckless pursuit of power could have turned this country into a chicken come home to roost scenario. Turning back to the indigenous people, their tragedy is ongoing. The hundreds of years of violence and suffering, the struggle to overcome generational trauma handed down by parents and grandparents is ongoing. And the systematic economic depravity is ongoing. And yet, to this day, you can still see the look of courage, determination, and fighting spirit in the faces of the descendants of the first people on the land. And there are still those today who carry on the traditions and the culture that were handed down to them by their forefathers. The present-day First Nations people of Turtle Island, which includes Canada, have not finished writing their own page in the history books of tomorrow. Now on to my journey. As I travel on horseback through the southwestern United States, the spaciousness of land and the absence of humongous structures made this part of the trail absolutely fascinating, as it gave me a sense of detachment from any resemblance of modern-day society while riding on the desert roads that lie adjacent to the South Pacific rail lines, a railroad network that began its operation in 1865 and operated largely in the western United States. There was also the ability to ride on some parts of the famous Butterfield Overland Trail, the route of the first transcontinental mail delivery by stagecoach. That started its operation in 1858 and ended in 1861. And then there was the awe of the nostalgia I felt while riding adjacent to the mountains that were once the stronghold of the Mescalero Chiricahua Apache warrior and military leader, Goyate, the one who yawns, namely Geronimo, who fought against the United States settlement and military invasion of his land for 36 years before surrendering in 1886 and then exiled in Florida. I was en route to Phoenix, and riding alongside the rail lines led me into Bowie, Arizona, and on into the old cowboy town of Wilcox, Arizona, where I stayed the night so that I could restock with horse feed and hay. The store wasn't far from the Rex Allen Museum. Rex Allen was a Hollywood Walk of Fame star nicknamed the Arizona Cowboy. From Wilcox, I again rode the Union Pacific rails and off-highway roads straight into Dragoon, Arizona, a town of approximately 200 people living on approximately 2 square miles of land, nestled among the Dragoon Mountains. Those mountains, again, were the stronghold of another Chiricahua Apache, Cochise. He was a key warrior during the Apache Wars and who led an uprising that began in 1861 and ended 11 years later in a negotiated peace treaty in 1872. While riding through Dragoon, I was greeted by Grandma J, and she invited us to stay on her residence. She was a woman of indigenous heritage who was a designer and maker of indigenous clothing and artifacts. Her home was a showroom of her craftsmanship and designs. After a day or two in Dragoon, I continued my journey across Arizona and entered Tucson, where I met this artist who creates these types of masterpieces, as shown here. And when people say they don't believe in coincidence, then perhaps someone can please explain to me what it is when, out of the blue, I would run into this man who I never laid eyes on before, never heard of before, but who just happened to be the brother of my brother in law. And also, why, back in this small, remote town in West Texas, I just happened to run into these traveling couple whom I knew very well because they owned a store just up the road from where I lived in New Jersey. So if these are not coincidences, then can someone please tell me what they are? After a brief stay in Tucson, I continued heading for the Indian reservation in the Sonoran Desert, where I would conduct an interview with Professor James Writing In. He was a citizen of the Pawnee Nation and associate professor of American Indian Studies at Arizona State University. And after our interview, he wrote an article from which I will read this brief excerpt. It begins. It was a pleasure to have met Miles on March the 9th, 2008, in the Sonora Desert on the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community Reservation. And he was making his epic cross-country ride to educate the nation about issues facing African American Indians and African Americans. On that day, he sat tall and straight in the saddle as he rode Sankofa on the site of a powwow honoring American Indian veterans. He and his beautiful Arabian stallion immediately attracted the attention of children who flocked around both of them. It was a beautiful sight to behold. The entirety of Miles's trip took him through Indian country, and traveling on horseback surely gave him the opportunity to ponder the beauty of the landscape and how it must have changed since the destructive arrival of the European colonizers. A stark reality of history is that most of the land he traversed had long since been cleared of its indigenous inhabitants who had prospered by living in harmony with nature. I'm going to stop here. And for anyone who has interested or who is interested in reading the article in its entirety, I'm going to post it on my YouTube channel since it is difficult to read it on my website, where it is now located because the site is in dire need of a makeover. And as I do not have the expertise myself, nor the funding sources at this time to have it done by someone else, I'm going to put a link on my Facebook page linking it to the YouTube article. After leaving the reservation, I again began riding towards Phoenix as I was anxious to see my mother and sister, who were awaiting my arrival. My mother was flying in from New Jersey, and my sister lived in Phoenix. I knew it would be a wonderful family reunion after being 5 months on the road. And it was also going to be where I would, again, change drivers. But what happened in Phoenix was totally unexpected and literally overwhelming. Join me on my next podcast as I ride the trail into Phoenix and then into the Chocolate Mountains of California. And until then, pay close attention. And as always, happy trails to you. Till we meet again.